This podcast series is full of difficult and troubling content from the start. Please take care while listening.
For our sixth and final episode, we have breaking news. You may remember in episode 4, Star Witness, we broke the story that one of the 4 consultants at the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, who accused Lucy Letby of murder, had accidentally killed a baby a year before.
That consultant has been granted anonymity by a court order. She was Dr. B in the Lucy Letby trial and Dr. V in the Thirlwall public inquiry. We will call her Dr. B. We have now seen more information on the killing of baby Noah Robinson, information that the jury never saw and has not been made public in the Thirlwall inquiry.
Remember, there were 2 doctors looking after baby Noah at the neonatal unit in 2014. A junior doctor placed the breathing tube down the esophagus, not the trachea. The consultant, and so the senior doctor, Dr. B, had another go and made the same mistake. At baby Noah's inquest, it came out that Dr. B ignored 5 warning signs that the breathing tube was in the wrong place.
The new information comes from another fantastic digger, Anouk Curry. It is a note of an interview given by the Countess of Chester Hospital neonatal manager, Arian Powell, during Lucy Letby's grievance procedure before she was charged by the police. It has Powell saying, "Dr. B accidentally killed a baby once." Intubation, by the way, we believe this is a typo for intubation, is very difficult. Nursing staff were supportive. There was evidence in that case, but yet Dr. B was not suspended. And now Dr. Stephen Brewery has gut instincts and wants Lucy Letby suspended.
We have also seen from day 85 of Lucy Letby's first trial, a statement from the mother of babies O and P, 2 of the triplets who later died. It reads, "Dr. B was coughing and spluttering into her hands, then goes outside for a smoke. I never saw her wash her hands, which I thought was unacceptable."
So this is clear evidence that doctors and nurses at the neonatal unit in the hospital worked to utterly different standards. Dr. B killed a baby, and that got covered up, or at least the jury did not hear about it, and the Thirlwall inquiry did not publish the note. The inquiry put pages 1, 2 and 4 of Powell's interview into the public domain, but not page 3, the page where the neonatal unit manager said that Dr. B had accidentally killed a baby. Once again, there is no direct evidence that Lucy Letby ever harmed a baby. The doctor who killed enjoys anonymity. The nurse is in prison for the rest of her natural life on circumstantial evidence alone. The doctor who killed stays in the shadows. Lucy Letby is a very public monster.
Throughout this podcast, John and I have wrestled with the convictions against Lucy Letby because they are based on deductions from theories, not observed fact. But what if the whole basis for her trials was so profoundly unfair to be rotten from the start? You're listening to Was There Ever a Crime? The Trials of Lucy Letby, Episode 6, The Framing of Lucy Letby, with me, John Sweeney. And me, Edward Abel Smith.
We put our new information on what appears to be the cover-up of Dr. B's fatal errors to her fellow consultants who accused Lucy Letby, the Countess of Chester Hospital, Cheshire Police, and the Crown Prosecution Service.
From Dr. B and the other doctors, we received no reply. Cheshire Police told us that 2 juries convicted Lucy Letby of 7 murders and 8 attempted murders. The appeal court have rejected her attempts to overturn the convictions, and investigations by Cheshire Police continue. The Countess of Chester Hospital said, due to the ongoing Thirlwall inquiry and police investigations, it would not be appropriate for us to comment at this time. The Thirlwall inquiry told us
The inquiry only publishes material which has been shown on screen to a witness when they are giving evidence.
For the guts of our final episode, we spoke to Phil Hammond, an NHS doctor for 35 years, now retired, and for 30 years the writer of the MD column in Private Eye. Phil Hammond has been a powerful but fair-minded critic of the convictions of murder and attempted murder against Lucy Letby.
Phil, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but have you listened to our first episode?
Yes, I just have. I was listening to it on 1.5 speed to try and get it all through. So three-quarters of the way through.
That was a nervy question to ask.
I think it's the bit, actually, that hasn't received sufficient attention, because we now know loads of babies had gas in their abdomen. And we know 2 of them had gas in their abdomen when Lucy Letby wasn't on duty, although that seems to have passed the jury by. And one of the causes, perhaps, of gas in the abdomen is some sort of gut infection, and that clearly could have been something from the shitty taps. And because it was never really explored at all, it only gets explored if you bring an expert witness to talk about it at a trial, and nobody talked about it other than the plumber who came in to say, yes, there was shit everywhere.
Yes, the plumber's good.
Yeah, he's good, isn't it? When you're reading out the plumber bit, I was surprised you didn't do a Cockney accent, but you were very good.
He's Italian Cheshire, and I was brought up in Cheshire for 5 years.
Oh, so you know it all, yeah.
But I was getting ready to do Italian Mario the plumber. You know, there was shit everywhere.
But also the fact that you ask Roger Norris, but you ask any experienced neonatologist, have they ever worked in a unit that had sewage leaks, and they just look askance and go, well, of course I haven't. That's a ridiculous thing to suggest.
Okay, so you're a retired GP, correct?
I was a GP for about 20 odd years. Then I did about 5 years in sexual health, and then I did 11 years in pediatrics, but it was pediatric chronic fatigue, ME, CFS, long COVID, things we don't fully understand. So I worked in pediatrics for the last 11 years, but not on intensive care. I did 6 months of neonatology as part of my GP training, but that was in the 80s. So I'm in no sense a neonatology expert.
Okay. However, let's talk about Dr. Dowie Evans. He's the prosecution's star witness, and he is a very good witness. He's very good in the witness box. How do you rate him as a scientist and as a doctor?
It's hard to know. I mean, the positive point about him is that he answers pretty much every single one of your questions. So he contacted me after I started writing in Private Eye, questioning the trial, and he wanted to put his side of the story. And every question I asked him, he would answer fairly quickly and fairly courteously, but with absolute certainty that he was right, which is always a red flag for me in cases that have a fair degree of certainty, whether you're talking about the pandemic. I always said in the pandemic that the more certain someone is, the less you should trust them and the further you should stand from them. And I think this part of that is true of this. There's a high degree of uncertainty. And when a witness is so certain, purely on the basis of deductive reasoning, they've just ruled out other things and think it must be an air embolism or it must be air in the stomach, even though there isn't much pathological evidence to back it up. That just fires a bit of a red flag. He boasted to me that in his 35 years, he's only ever lost one serious case in murder or negligence or gross negligence manslaughter. And he's very proud of that fact. And again, that's a red flag for me, because that's not really, in my view, what an independent expert witness should be about. You probably win as many as you'll use. You're there to serve the court. If you're the only witnesses, you're also duty-bound to look over the fence at other more plausible alternatives. You're not there to win it for your side and to boast about how many times you win. That's, to me, isn't the role of an expert witness, although I personally have never been one. So he's very courteous. He answers the questions, but his level of certainty and his level of pride in very rarely losing are big red flags for me.
So remember, our podcast is for a very broad audience, and a lot of people aren't across the detail. Can you give a summary of what he told the court, in particular at the first trial of Lucy Letby?
I think we have to go slightly before that as how he got involved in the trial. And I hadn't realised you were able to do this, but he volunteered his services to Cheshire Police. He'd heard that they needed someone and volunteered his service. He was then paid for by the police to screen the notes. He said to the police, show me some notes. And they decided to show him a picture of a baby who'd suffered liver injury, or so the allegation was. And within 10 minutes, he was pretty certain he was dealing with murder just by looking at one load of case notes for 10 minutes. So he's paid by the police to screen the notes and come up with his theories or hypotheses of murder. And then he's paid by the court again to be an expert witness on his own theories. So in essence, he's marking his own homework. He's paid for the police once, and then he's paid for by the court.
We put that to Dr. Dowie Evans, and he told us,
Phil Hammond has mentioned the paid by the police and paid by the court as a conflict of interest. No disrespect, but that's how the system works. It's not seen as a conflict of interest. I think this reflects his lack of experience. He told me that he had never been involved as an expert witness. Dr. Evans added that 2 other experts supported his opinions.
And he's a very confident performer. And he was absolutely certain not only that these babies had died, either from air injected into a vein, air or fluid injected into the nasogastric tube, in one case punching in the liver, and in other cases deliberate dislodgement of the nasogastric tubes. But his big 2 were air in the vein and air down the stomach tube, almost with absolute certainty, to the extent that he said if he'd been called in earlier, if the police had called him earlier or the hospital had called him earlier, he would have spotted the first death. Lucy Letby would have been stopped immediately and there would have been no more deaths. He was that confident, gave lots of interviews after about how he was the person who caught Lucy Letby. And his level of certainty is absolutely staggering. And I've got 68 pages of email conversation with him. And he very rarely wavers in his belief that she's guilty. However, if you look at the court transcripts, he changed his mind a lot. Particularly over one baby, baby C. Initially, he couldn't say why the baby had died. He was absolutely certain this baby had died because air had gone down its nasogastric tube and splintered the diaphragm to stop the baby breathing. Because he'd never put that in any of his reports. That fired a few alarm bells in court. But then while he was being cross-examined by Letby's barrister, he then added that the baby could also have died by having air injected into a vein. He submitted 8 reports on baby C that kept changing. And he says only a week or so ago, he's finally finished his last report on baby C. And that's just 14 months after Lucy Letby was convicted of killing baby C. So although he's very certain of the fact that she's a murderer, he's not quite so certain now as to how particular babies died. And he seems to have changed his position because air embolism is very difficult to prove. And the doctors who suspected it didn't tell the coroner that they suspected it, so no post-mortem CT scans were done. They didn't open the heart underwater to see if there's any air in it. There's no definitive proof. And so I think now he's settled on air embolism because we can't prove it pathologically either way. It's just one person's argument against another. But he's abandoned, and he wrote to Channel 5 and said that he was abandoning his idea that air in the stomach could kill or air in the fluid could kill. And to me, that's very significant. And I think he did that because 8 currently practicing neonatologists wrote to The Guardian and said, we think this theory is ludicrous. Air gets in the stomach of babies all the time, particularly the little babies that are quite hard to get a secure mask on top of. So often you will pump air into their stomach instead of their lungs. It's quite easy to spot clinically, and then you just withdraw the air again with a syringe. So very rarely do babies die of this. And I think because currently practicing neonatologists appear to be laughing at him, he changed his position and suddenly said, no, I don't think any of the babies died by this. I think that was just to stabilize them. I think all the babies died from air injected into a vein. If you're not an expert, it is confusing to follow, but the fact he's changed his position so many times, was allowed to do so in court, and has done so again after the verdict, to me is pretty concerning too.
Well, let's deal with baby C. He told the jury that baby C died how?
Initially, he didn't know. Then he agreed with his other expert that air was injected into the stomach. So much of it was injected that it splintered the diaphragm and crushed the lungs, and that caused death. And then under questioning about this, he added in a third possibility that Letby had also killed the baby by injecting air into a vein. It was quite confusing. The prosecution barrister, Nicholas Johnson, went with the air down the stomach theory. So when he advised The jury, in his summing up, he said baby C was killed by injecting air into the stomach. And that has now been disowned by Dewey Evans. So to me, that should be grounds for an appeal without having to go to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. It seems to me he's changed his position. He's withdrawn a vital piece of evidence, but he sort of covered his bases. He said Letby was so brilliant as a murderer. She could murder babies by 3 or 4 different methods. One was punched in the liver before it had air injected, etc. It makes no sense that nobody observed her doing these things, but to me, you shouldn't be allowed to keep changing your position during a trial. I'm not a lawyer, but that seems an absolute nonsense that you can keep changing your position. He said new evidence came along, so I looked at the notes, and then when I heard people get evidence, I changed my position because of what the doctors were saying. But
isn't it the case, though, that after the end of the trial, that fresh evidence was dug up? I forget which, was it File on 4 or The Guardian?
File on 4.
BBC File on 4, fair play. They dug up fresh evidence that actually Lucy wasn't there for the critical X-ray or for the time prior to that critical X-ray.
That's true. So that was for baby C. So that embarrasses actually all the expert witnesses. So all the expert witnesses get together before the trial starts and they try and decide what they agree on, etc. And they all got together and they noticed a huge amount of gas in the stomach of baby C. And they all came up with this theory, including the pathologist and the radiographer, that this was due to deliberate air injection crushing the lungs. And it wasn't until the trial had started that somebody spotted, hang on, not only was she not on duty on this particular day, but she'd never at that point, according to the swipe card data and the duty records, ever met that baby. So couldn't possibly have been responsible for all that air. And it also happened to another baby as well, which sort of has dodged the radar. So there were 2 babies who had air in the stomach that must have been deliberately injected that turned out Lucy Letby wasn't on duty. So either somebody else was injecting air into the stomach, or actually the air into the stomach was due to other reasons, such as an infection, a bowel complaint, or somebody not bagging and masking very efficiently. So how the whole air in the stomach argument wasn't thrown out in court, I don't really understand.
Dr. Evans pointed out that he did not know that Lucy Letby was on duty when the suspicious event happened.
Okay, let's just talk about infection for a second. So our hypothesis, which we set out in episode 1 of our podcast, was that there was a serious and chronic problem with sewage because of broken pipes backing up and filling the sinks of the neonatal unit and the maternity units, and there's a lot of crossover between the two, with raw sewage, and inside raw sewage is killer bacteria. It can kill adults, and it can certainly kill premature and sick babies. And this chronic problem was not properly addressed for months and months and months and months and months. And because it was never properly addressed, I'm not even sure whether it was fully solved in our time frame. All we've got is Lucy Letby says so herself when she gave evidence in her own defense, but also a plumber said that there was a problem in the building, which is both the maternity and the neonatal unit, weekly. Mm-hmm. So is it possible that the air in the stomach of baby C and some of the other babies, so let's just talk about baby C, is it possible that came from sepsis, from infection caused by killer bacteria in the sewage? Is that medically possible?
I think it's possible. I mean, the gaping hole in this whole trial was the fact that they didn't get expert, currently practicing neonatologists to review the notes. And this is what's happening at the moment as part of a CCRC review.
CCRC stands for the Criminal Cases Review Commission. If the CCRC backs an appeal, it hurries up the process. But all of this is very, very early days.
So actually we need to ask the experts, but they will look at septic markers and signs of infection. And my understanding is in a few of these babies, there were markers of infection. And yes, that's a plausible way of getting an infection and probably more plausible than murder. And there have been notable examples in neonatal units and other units across the country of people dying in infectious disease outbreaks. There was one up in Edinburgh. And, you know, it's not unusual in the NHS for these outbreaks to happen, and clearly would be high risk.
Sorry to interrupt. You said a person, not a baby.
Yes, I mean, obviously babies are even more vulnerable. For example, one argument is the really weird, abnormally high insulin results may partly have been due to the fact that one of the babies was septic. And so there's a lot of cross-reaction when you do the particular test, which isn't definitive, the immunoassay for insulin, and there's a possibility that artificially raised the results. So all these things are being looked at by people who know what they're talking about. And I'm reasonably confident that when the CCRC review goes in, there'll be a very strong case made by currently practicing neonatologists that rather than saying these collapses were unexplained, they'll say, actually, there's a good explanation here. This unit that couldn't cope with this cohort of very sick babies because it didn't have the staffing, didn't have the facilities, it was an infection risk. These babies came in, and because they weren't used to dealing with such small babies, they didn't spot the risks. They didn't manage them in time. But if you take a really senior neonatology expert, they'll look at the notes and say, actually, given the way they managed this baby, I think that collapse was entirely predictable. I think there was a chance to rescue the baby, but then I think probably some of these resuscitations weren't very competent either. And they may argue, I think they will argue, that some of the babies could still be alive today had they received more competent neonatal care, and Lucy Letby's presence or absence was entirely coincidental, had nothing to do with it. That's what I think their line of argument will be. And then the question will be is whether the CCRC thinks this is significant enough to refer it back to the appeal court. And given the pressure it's under and the number of experts who are questioning this, I would hope they make that decision in a timely manner. I'm guessing you will know with the previous cases you've covered that it could take up to 10 years. Paul Foote used to say it takes 10 years to give the judge and the senior police officers time to retire. But I think in this case, because there is so much anger from people who know what they're talking about, not just armchair experts, I think they will have to reach a view fairly quickly. And I think more plausible causes will be put forward, and people will say, well, why didn't we consider those in the first place? And that goes back to the whole system of expert witnesses and how we use them in criminal trials.
Now, by the way, Dewey Evans, that's how it's pronounced. That's how it's spelt. But actually, I believe it's pronounced Dowie Evans.
Okay.
There's some eccentricity of the Welsh language. And I should point out that my grandfather, Stephen Owen, was Welsh, Montgomeryshire Yeomanry, before I get into trouble. Experts are all equal quality, true or false?
I think that's false. But I also think there's a legitimate, Dowie Evans gets very annoyed. He said, look, these are just my opinions. I stand by them. I think I'm right. But why are you having a go at me? It was up to the defense to produce experts of equivalent status to argue other theories, and they didn't. So he's really annoyed that all this focus has come onto him because the defense themselves didn't call, highly experienced practicing neonatologists.
That's a very good point, and one which John and I will discuss shortly. Dr. Hammond is worried that the real experts on premature babies are too busy saving lives to go to court.
Now, it's very hard to get them because they're currently practicing and very busy, and they don't want to give up a year of their life to a criminal trial. And so you tend to get people who have retired. And there's a real argument in specialties that move on as quickly as neonatology that just being out of the loop for 5 or 10 years and not used to neonatal intensive care means you're going to miss substandard care.
Dr. Hammond sees a chasm between the prosecution experts, led by Dr. Evans, seeing murder, and the new experts for Lucy Letby's defence. Of course, none were called by the original defence lawyers, who see no such thing. The prosecution experts had their day in court.
And they all said, we think the standard of clinical care is fine. This was clear murder.
But the other side, the jurors never heard what they think.
The practicing neonatologists I've spoken to said, actually, no, this was clearly substandard care. And I don't see any evidence of Lucy Letby doing anything other than nursing. So how can two groups of experts have diametrically opposed views based on the same evidence? And I think it's down to their current practicing experience. I think if you've been retired and you're out of the game, you're not going to practice, you're not going to spot what the ventilation pressure meant for the lung compression, meant for this, meant for that. It takes an absolute expert going through the notes in meticulous detail to do that.
Are you saying Dowie Evans wasn't an expert because he's retired?
I think he was fine in some areas of it, but I think in this particular case, what they needed was currently practicing neonatologists, and he's not one of those. And I think they should have insisted that currently practicing experts were the ones providing the evidence, because they're the best placed people to say how well these babies had been treated.
Why didn't the defense get one?
I don't know. And part of the thing I dislike about the whole adversarial process is the defense might have got one. They might have got people who said, actually, I agree with Dowie Evans. And because the defense don't have to disclose their reports, I think they should. I think actually experts should not appear for the prosecution or the defense. You should actually have a multidisciplinary panel of currently practicing experts who produce a report for the court, not paid for by prosecution and defense. So there's no hint of being bought and currying favor with your particular side. And that's what should have happened. So I don't know what the defense did, because Benjamin Myers isn't speaking to anyone, but it may be they did get expert opinions and the expert opinions weren't helpful.
Ben Myers was the lead prosecution barrister for Lucy Letby.
They did get one guy. What's his name? Michael Hall.
Mike Hall. So they got Mike Hall, he was also
by
retired.
the way,
but
so we can explain. Sorry to interrupt. He was. He wrote reports, but the defense never used him.
He was more recently practicing than Dowie Evans, so he had retired, but I would say had more neonatology expertise than Dowie Evans, but a very different approach. So in his approach, which I immediately find more trustworthy, is that he would acknowledge uncertainty. He would say, on the one hand, on the other hand, I think this might be this. I can't think we can be absolutely sure. Whereas Dowie Evans' approach was to be absolutely certain about stuff, very, very confident in the stand. This is definitely what happened. Whereas Michael was more, well, I personally think some of the babies were much sicker than you are portraying. I don't think they were all well. I think some of them might have been unwell, but I think generally on the whole, in some but not all of the cases, we could argue this. And so he was very much, as you'd expect, I would expect an argument to go in terms of assessing evidence on both sides. Whereas Dowie Evans just looked at the prosecution case, looked at the evidence to fit that case and absolutely hammered it home. So maybe those two differing styles wouldn't have suited, but also Ben Myers halfway through the trial tried to get it thrown out. So he tried to argue that Dowie Evans wasn't a reliable witness because another judge, Jeffries, had written to Judge Goss, almost unheard of, in December during the trial, saying Dowie Evans provided expert witness in a case that I was involved in, and it turned out to be unreliable and worthless. And I want to warn you of that. I've never heard of that happening, but I don't have much experience of what goes on in court. But that seems like a fairly big red flag. But he tried to get it thrown out, A, because he tried to go for Dowie Evans, and B, he tried to say that murder by air embolism is so rare. They didn't do the CT scans or the proper post-mortems because the pathologists weren't warned. So there is no evidence and there's no real expertise in this area. So I don't think expertise exists. What he needed was an expert to give alternative plausible causes for the deaths. And that's what was missing. So all we heard was murder causes. Nobody gave other causes. The barrister tried to do that, but as you know, what comes out of a barrister's mouth isn't evidence. He was very aggressive and assertive, and he tried to take down Dowie Evans, and Dowie Evans took all the fire. But anything that comes out of a barrister's mouth doesn't constitute evidence. So he had to have his own experts, and now experts have lined up to help Mark MacDonald, who is the new barrister who's just taken over, and I think we'll get a more balanced view, which was missing in the original trial.
I was on a jury, and obviously I'm not going to talk about the details of my case, but I can remember vividly thinking, and I'm sure my fellow jurors thought the same, that it would be terrible to ruin somebody's life and send them to prison unless I was very clear in my own mind that this person had committed a crime. So I'm a great believer in the jury system, but I can remember when my kids were little, I can remember my son being very sick, and I was intensely grateful when a doctor came round and did a home visit. And thank you, doctor, thank you. And so I think that when a doctor who people trust implicitly turns up as a witness and stands in the witness box and says, effectively guilty. So unless you have other doctors batting for the defense and saying, This isn't dishonesty at all. It's just, it's easy journalism for us and for you writing your columns in Private Eye to set out the evidence that there are multiple reasons why these babies died, nothing to do with murder. Number one, they're very sick. Number two, there was shit in the hospital and killer bacteria inside the shit, and there's a finding of that. Number three, the doctors, according to their own Royal College, the consultants, were doing 2 scheduled ward rounds a week, and it should be 2 a day. Number 4 is the experienced nurses were all got rid of some years before. So staffing and morale of the nurses was dreadful. And so you've got 5 good reasons there, which explain a very badly run unit, which was an infection factory.
Yes, well, it's interesting that Myers made all these points as a barrister, and none of them counted, because he was saying then he needed, as you say, doctors to say that. But probably what persuaded the jury more is that 7 doctors, 7 paediatric consultants working at the Countess of Chester Hospital were united, at least it appeared to be united in believing she's guilty. So not only did you have the expert witnesses, you had 7 consultants. So 6 expert witnesses plus 7 consultants, which is what the total was, is 13 doctors all convinced Letby is guilty, and not a single doctor speaking up for her. So it was actually 13-0.
Fine. Now the score now that she's in prison for whole life orders, 14 whole life orders, something like this. What's the score now in footballing terms?
Well, I haven't, since I started writing, gosh, I know my 8th Private Eye column, and I haven't had a single neonatologist or expert in this area speaking up for Dowie Evans and those theories. And there were 24 experts who wrote a letter saying, particularly about how the statistics was presented in the trial. But I would say, there are dozens and dozens probably of experts who are uncomfortable with the verdict. So that begs the question, where were they at the time? Why don't people want to be expert witnesses in trials of this nature? Is it the time commitment? Is it the pay? Is it the fact that we splashed all over the Sun or the Daily Mail supporting a baby killer? I think that's why we need to take away the expert witnesses from one side or another so people can give independent expertise within a panel that serves the court, but not the defense or the prosecution. The other thing that's really important to consider is that how can it be that 7 consultant pediatricians, if you're going to take the alternative narrative, didn't realize they were delivering substandard care? So that's really interesting. So if we're going to say that the new Letby defense team are going to say, actually, this can all be explained with very sick babies receiving substandard care, is it possible for these consultants not to realize they were delivering it because they wrote to their managers saying, we're short of 3 consultants. We don't have enough nurses. If we're not careful, babies are going to suffer. And when babies suffered, they didn't spot it. Now, did they genuinely not spot it? Did nobody say, hang on, could this just be we're a bit out of our depth here? That's what the big riddle that needs to be explained is, because if you're going to argue it was substandard care, why did none of those paediatricians in Chester spot it? If you take paediatric and maternity care in the NHS overall, Jeremy Hunt, when he was chair of the Health Select Committee, tried to compare the UK with Sweden and came up with a conclusion that 1,000 babies die every year from substandard maternity and neonatal care in England who would be alive if we had the same standards and staffing as Sweden. So it's not unusual in level 2 or level 1 neonatal units across the country for sicker babies than expected to turn up and for them to die or suffer. And normally what happens is we say, oh, never mind, you did your best. You were understaffed. You didn't have the expertise. In a level 3 top unit, this baby probably would have survived, but it didn't. And we're just going to hush it up quietly because that's just the NHS for you. Unlucky. Let's not say anything. What's happened here is because the consultants have invited scrutiny, they've cried murder, then in return, they're going to bet the most savage scrutiny of their own clinical competence, which in normal circumstances within the NHS we cover up. So if they'd not cried murder, we'd have just said, look, there were these sick babies. We had a statistical blip. I'm very sorry about that. The parents would have grieved and moved on. But the fact that they've cried murder means they're now inviting the defense to come out and say, okay, let's really look at this and see how good your care was. And my guess is they will discover substandard care. And lawyers now representing the parents might look at this and go, well, hang on, there's probably more money to be made in clinical negligence than there is in murder. So you may find a shift in some of the lawyers representing the parents saying, hang on, this could be something more lucrative. So whatever happens out of this, the lawyers will win.
That's not a comforting thought. But there is a case, but hold on, let's return our focus. Lucy Letby has had her life ruined and her liberty taken from her on the basis of what? How would you characterize the evidence against her?
Well, that's the thing that struck me. I mean, unlike you, because you were onto this very quickly. I remember you tweeted very quickly after the verdict.
The day she was convicted.
Yeah. And I wasn't really following it. In private eye, I generally follow. I was doing a lot of pandemic stuff, and I do a lot about system changes and things. And I don't generally do court stuff. And it was only because Ian Hislop asked me shortly after the verdict, could I quickly write a paragraph? The paragraph I wrote brought in support of the doctors. I phoned up someone I knew at the hospital, and the narrative then was these poor doctor whistleblowers, they all tried to blow the whistle and the evil management didn't listen. And this is appalling. And had the managers listened, we would have stopped Letby sooner. And therefore, the police are going to charge the hospital with corporate manslaughter, and there will be dozens more charges. Everyone was confident there would be dozens, perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands more charges as they went back and looked at her history. And that went out, and it was Mike Hall, the defense witness expert who wasn't used, who contacted the eye and various other neonatologists saying, Phil, will you have another look at this? You've made a snap judgment. There isn't any evidence there. We can't find any definitive evidence. I mean, A, she didn't admit it. B, she wasn't caught in the act. And C, we think there are more plausible reasons for this harm and death than murder. And it reminded me of an old professor of medicine used to say to me, when you hear hooves on the footbridge, think first of the horse before you think of the zebra, before you think of the unicorn. So in medicine, common things are common, and babies dying because they're sick and receive substandard care in an underfunded NHS is very, very common. Murder is very, very rare. So you always have to exclude the common things before you move on to the incredibly rare things, and they simply didn't do that. So basically, it was a process of deduction without any decent pathological proof. There are some disputed skin rashes. There are some disputed x-rays that were taken after death. There were no CT scans. The theory of injecting air into the stomach, even Dowie Evans is now disowning. So the whole thing is just slightly falling to pieces. And it was very noticeable to me that in her latest appeal on the retrial in Baby K, which she lost predictably, because it was basically her word against the consultants, but the appeal court judges acknowledged that there was a decent body of scientific evidence now questioning this verdict. It was a slight slap on the wrist for Thirlwall, who'd called it noise, but they were saying, no, there is a decent evidence. They actually criticized one of the consultants, Ravi Jayaram, saying, look, you thought you caught a red-handed dislodging a tube and you did nothing for months. Why was that? That doesn't stack up. They criticized some of his evidence, and they said there may be a legal setting where these matters need to be explored, and that will clearly be the Clinical Cases Review Commission. So I think even the legal profession have realized they've made a howler and that this will have to be looked at again. It's just, what's the quickest way of doing it? If you have locked up somebody who's innocent, what's the quickest way of getting her justice?
One of the cases we looked at happened a year before, and this is a story that there was a baby who subsequently died, and the baby was very low on oxygen, and the consultants, or the doctors rather, they put the oxygen tube not down the trachea, but down the esophagus.
The endotracheal tube, yes, yeah.
Yeah, they put it in the wrong place. And so what that is effectively is they're putting the oxygen down towards the tummy, not towards the lungs. And there was 5 indicators that they'd put the breathing tube, the oxygen tube, in the wrong place, in a lack of the monitor showing the oxygen level in the blood wasn't moving. That was very low. There was even apparently an X-ray, and there were 5 things. And the view of the consultant and the doctor, I think there were 2 people, was that the monitors were wrong. And the coroner said, no, this is like when you're flying with a jet and the monitors say you're low on fuel. Oh, there must be a mistake with the monitor.
Yeah.
Now, this is, it looks to be a terrible mistake. And we don't know whether the consultant who was part of that mistake, i.e., and it's 2 mistakes. One is putting it in the wrong place. 2 is not trusting the monitors for telling the truth, which they were, that the baby was still very low on oxygen. Was one of these consultants one of the accusers of Lucy Letby? And there's an example, perhaps, of skin in the game. But it's also true to say that the people, the accusation of murder against Lucy Letby is it just so happens to be the accusation which clears the consultants of poor behavior, poor conduct. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Well, it's why the notes have to be reviewed in meticulous detail by high-level, currently practicing neonatologists to see whether they detect substandard care. And I'm not one of them. My prediction is that they will, based on conversations I've had with some of them, but we need to wait until those reports come out. But we know, for example, with baby K, which is the case that Letby has just been refused grounds to appeal on, the registrar tried to intubate this very tiny baby twice and failed and did it a 3rd time. So in most units, they say if the trainee can't do it twice, the consultant must step in and do it. But in this case, for whatever reason, the registrar tried 3 times, struggled to get the right size tube in. There was leakage from the tube. But the thing that really puzzled me is that on an ITV interview, Dr. Jayaram said very clearly, the only explanation for this tube becoming dislodged was that Letby had pulled it out. Whereas again, if you speak to currently practicing neonatologists who are used to dealing with such tiny babies, they say tiny babies dislodge their own tubes really commonly. The reason it happens is that it's really hard getting that tube in exactly the right place. If you get it in too far, it only inflates one of the lungs. If you pull it out too much, it comes out. So just a very fine margin of error. The second thing is we don't like to sedate these tiny babies' brains. We like them to keep moving about. And so we don't give them much sedation. So they move about a lot and that dislodges the tube. And the third thing is that a premature baby's skin is really delicate. It's quite hard fixing anything to the skin to stop the tube coming out. So she said it's not a commonplace, but it's such a known fact that we have a parent information leaflet on why babies dislodge their own tubes. So if that's known within the neonatal profession, how can a doctor say there are no other explanations other than her just pulling the tube out? Because we know it's well evidence-based that babies dislodge their own tube. So there are bits of it that just smell a bit funny.
I asked Dr. Hammond about the triplets born from the same placenta. The point being, that is a great big red flag. But their chances of surviving are 5 times worse than a baby born in a single birth. But the jury never heard that.
All the neonatologists I've spoken to, the first thing they've said is those triplets should never have been delivered at the Countess of Chester Hospital. So why they were delivered there, we don't know. So maybe they were planned to be delivered there and then transferred to a level 3 centre, but it would have been far better because Countess of Chester also had problems in its maternity department. You quoted the dad of the triplets about his experience of the birth and how horrific and soul-destroying the surroundings were.
He said it was like a horror movie.
Yeah. So there's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is wait until the report comes out on how the baby with liver damage was handled. Dowie Evans said they think that she came back from holiday, and it's probably the most compelling bit if you read the transcript of the trial. She was ready to kill. She'd already perfected the art of injecting air in the stomach and into the vein. But for added measure, she decided to punch this baby really hard over the liver. And that was the most compelling part of it. If you look at the notes, I've seen some of the notes, and I've now got the court transcripts. It appears that They may have overpressurized the lungs when they were doing the resuscitation. It could have pushed the liver down. One of the consultants actually stuck a needle into the abdomen, supposedly over McBurney's point, which is where the appendix is. Why he was doing that, I don't know. But according to one of the witnesses, he went a bit high. He drew back blood. Now, it's possible that that needle went into the liver. It's possible that the damage to the liver was caused by that needle. We need expert advice to look at it, but there are certainly other plausible causes. 3 other pathologists have said to me a subcapsular hematoma, which is rare but recognized, often happens in multiple births, such as triplets, could have happened naturally during the birth. And that combination with resuscitation, so the baby was resuscitated, pressing over the liver during resuscitation, could have caused the liver injury that the pathologist witnessed. And so that allowed everyone to jump on this bandwagon that she'd punched the baby in the liver, again, completely unwitnessed. Yeah.
So this is a struggling NHS hospital when the NHS is struggling. And the moment they voluntarily downgrade, they lose income.
They do. Mm-hmm. But when you look about how much money we spend on negligence in the NHS, we spend more money defending negligence claims in maternity and neonatology than we do on the services.
Dr. Hammond is on the money. In 2022, the NHS faced a £6 billion bill for medical cock-ups, more than half of which were claims for mistakes involving birth and neonatal care.
So actually, the flip side of that is if you carry on providing services and you're not up to the task of doing so, then negligence fees will come and take you down. So I think this is far more broader than Chester. This is actually a problem with substandard maternity and neonatal care across the NHS. And if it had been couched in those terms at the very beginning, we might have had an inquiry into the standard of neonatal and maternity care across the NHS is what we urgently need. That's where we need to be putting our money and our focus. It needs to be all about safe staffing levels and training. It may turn out to be a massive waste of money, as well as all the harm done to people that could have been better spent in improving neonatal and maternity services across the NHS.
My final question to Dr. Hammond touched on the culture inside the NHS, where fellow nurses seem to feel afraid to defend Lucy Letby.
What I've noticed, and I think the thing that worries me most, it took me a year to find a neonatal nurse to speak out. So the voice of nurses has really been marginalized in this. The ones who think that she was innocent were told not to volunteer themselves to give evidence at her trial. They've been largely written out of the Thirlwell inquiry, although it's very interesting that some of the more senior nurses said, look, we didn't see any evidence of her harming anyone. We still haven't. I'm still slightly mystified by it. Neonatal nursing is not a solitary thing. You are grouped around. There's often 1 or 2 people there. It would be extraordinarily difficult to inject 5 syringes of air into a nasogastric tube to compress the lungs and then put air into the vein, into the umbilical artery catheter, and then punch the baby in the liver for good measure without being observed. They just don't quite get it. And even without CCTV cameras, generally, you would probably, unless someone is brilliant, you would probably spot it. The final point I'd make, which I think is really interesting, is that Lucy Letby is either a very clever killer or a very stupid one. The stupid bit is that even though she knew she was under suspicion, she left all her handover notes and all her counselling post-it notes for the police to find. They even dug up her garden for some reason. I mean, when she knew that she was suspended under suspicion, why leave all that evidence behind? She had 13,000 Facebook messages sent to a doctor. She was accused of manipulating this doctor, but when you consider this doctor was a lot older with teenage children, you have to question who was manipulating whom. But the thing that doesn't stack up is in all these bizarre methods of murder that Dowie Evans came up with. So as well as pulling the tube out, air in the stomach, air in the veins, contaminating the insulin, not being on duty when the insulin is contaminated, so somehow managing to put so much insulin in all the bags, hoping that one at random would be picked. That would probably wipe out the entire insulin store in the unit. That wasn't noticed. But she came up with all these really clever things, but there's no evidence of her once doing an internet search to figure it out. So all her Facebook searches are there for the police to find. There's no evidence anywhere of her looking up death by air embolism or death by insulin injection or death by dislodging tubes. I find that very peculiar that she would leave all that Facebook trace and all that evidence in her bedroom, but not a single trace of any internet search as to how she was doing any of this.
So the possibility is she's not a killer at all.
Yes, there's still a possibility. And It's very hard to spot medical killers because they're always on the scene. Shipman was spotted because he used the same modus operandi all the time. He was morphine overdoses, and that was fairly easy to prove. We've never had someone use such a scattergun approach of 4 or 5 different methods to kill babies and not ever be spotted and not ever do a search of it.
But your old prof, I think, is right. When you hear horses' hooves,
yeah,
think
of the horse.
Think of a horse before you think of the zebra.
Before you think of the unicorn, yeah.
One thing I just wanted to follow on with on that point about the notes in her house and the fact that it's relatively recently come out that those post-it notes that she was writing, her so-called confessions, were done on the advice of her counsellor. Have you come across anything around her, whether she was on medication later on, post her being taken off the ward and these convictions being brought against her?
It may turn out she was the original whistleblower. It may be fascinating to discover that in her grievance when she was taken away from the unit, she was the one who was raising concerns about how unsafe the care was. If you actually read her evidence, and we've now paid a lot of money to get all the court transcripts, she's constantly critiquing the evidence of good care on the unit. She's saying, no, the care was substandard. The care we were providing was substandard. And that annoyed the doctors even more. She may turn out to be the original whistleblower. So we all talked about the heroic doctors being the whistleblower. It is possible that Lucy Letby was the whistleblower. She was the one saying, God, we're really not handling this well. We shouldn't be dealing with such sick babies here. That's a possibility.
That's Dr. Phil Hammond there, bringing the latest from the medical front line on what many doctors believe is a tragic miscarriage of justice.
At the end of this podcast, we are left with the sickening sense that it's easier for society to point the finger at one lone woman than to understand that parts of our beloved but broken NHS have become infection factories that do not treat but kill their patients, and that the Niagara of emotion that flows from the death of the baby in particular blinds us to that truth. In the 21st century, it's weird to think that we might be no better from people in the Middle Ages who, when times were bad, went hunting witches. No better at all.
We're crowdfunding this podcast to pay for its production costs. If you're able to support, the link to the crowdfunder is on our social media feed. Even though this is our last episode, we still have bills to pay. If you have any information you think could be useful to us, please email us on Lucy Letby, was there ever a crime @gmail.com.
Was There Ever a Crime? The Trials of Lucy Letby was investigated, presented and produced by me, John Sweeney, and Edward Abel Smith. This is a Chalk and Blade production, co-produced by Jason Phipps and Ruth Barnes. Ross Ramsey Golding is the editor. Legal services were provided by Sarah Van Dor Mackay at Review and Cleared. Research and reporting by Cleusi de Oliveira and Anouk Curry.
We will be doing a bonus episode reviewing the whole story, and that will be our final episode.